You're here to relax, and I'm here to guide you. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let go of everything that happened today. This moment is just for you. In the calm of the night, or the stillness of the early morning, wherever you are, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and it helps me feel closer to you, even across the distance. Now close your eyes if you'd like. Let's begin. I've always been a bargain hunter. My apartment is furnished almost entirely with second-hand finds. Mismatched furniture with character, vintage decor that tells stories of past lives. My friends call it eclectic, but truthfully, it's the result of a grad student budget stretched too thin across Boston's astronomical living costs. 3 years into my forensic psychology program at Northeastern, and I was still living like an undergraduate, pinching pennies wherever I could. That's why Craigslist had become my digital hunting ground. I'd spent countless hours scrolling through listings, messaging strangers, and driving to unfamiliar neighborhoods for that perfect piece at the right price. Over the years, I developed a certain confidence in my ability to navigate these exchanges safely. I always met in public places when possible, told someone where I was going, and trusted my gut when something felt off. My apartment had slowly transformed from a barren white box into something with personality. The coffee table from a retiring professor in Cambridge, the bookshelf from a young couple moving to Seattle, the floor lamp from an estate sale in Brookline. Each piece had a story, a history I could trace. I liked knowing where things came from. Maybe that was the budding psychologist in me, always trying to understand origins and contexts. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted that instinct more the day I responded to the listing for the mid-century dresser. It appeared in my search results on a dreary November afternoon as I sat huddled under a blanket in my living room, procrastinating on a paper about criminal pathology patterns. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning Boston into a gray watercolor painting, the edges of everything bleeding together. I'd been feeling restless, confined by both the weather and the looming deadlines of the semester. The photo showed a pristine walnut dresser with brass hardware that would perfectly complement my bedroom aesthetic. 6 drawers, tapered legs, clean lines, exactly what I'd been picturing but hadn't found in my price range. The warm wood tones would offset the cool blues of my bedroom walls, bringing some balance to the space. The price was suspiciously low, $120 for a piece that would typically go for $500 or more in Boston's vintage shops. The description was minimal: mid-century walnut dresser, good condition, cash only, no delivery. No history of the piece, no explanation for the low price. No indication of why someone would practically give away such a beautiful piece of furniture. The listing had been posted that morning, and I knew these deals disappeared quickly. Without overthinking it, I sent a message expressing my interest and asking if it was still available. I included a bit about myself: graduate student, reliable, can pick up immediately, the usual assurances I offered to make myself seem like a desirable buyer. The response came within minutes. Yes, can show today, after dark only. Work schedule. Something about the curt reply and the after dark stipulation made me hesitate. Most of my Craigslist exchanges involved more back and forth, more social niceties. Usually, sellers would mention something about the item's history or provide more details. This terseness felt off, but I convinced myself it was just someone with an unusual work schedule, or perhaps someone not comfortable with English. After a brief exchange, we settled on 7:30 p.m. The address was in Somerville, in a residential area I wasn't particularly familiar with, but not far from the Porter Square T station. A quick Google search showed a neighborhood of older homes, many divided into apartments for the student population that flooded the Boston area. Normal enough. I told my roommate Kate where I was going and promised to text when I arrived and when I was heading home. Standard safety protocol. Kate was more cautious than me. She never bought anything secondhand from individuals, preferring the security of established stores, or at least well-reviewed online sellers. You know, there are perfectly good furniture stores with delivery services, right? She said, looking up from her laptop at our kitchen table. Her medical textbooks were spread around her like academic fortifications. Where's the fun in that? I replied, showing her the dresser picture. Look at this beauty. Worth a little adventure, don't you think? She rolled her eyes but couldn't help admiring the piece. Just be careful. Text me the address and set a safety timer on your phone. Yes, Mom, I teased. She threw a balled-up sticky note at me. Seriously, Alex, if I don't hear from you in 2 hours, I'm calling the police. Her tone was joking, but I knew she meant it. We laughed about it then. This was routine for us, her warning me about stranger danger, me promising to be careful. It had become a comfortable script that made these exchanges seem normal and safe. I wasn't laughing 2 hours later. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I tried to focus on my paper, managing to write a few paragraphs about the correlation between childhood trauma and adult criminal behavior. Ironically, my research centered on how people develop the ability to compartmentalize and present a normal facade while harboring violent tendencies. If only I'd been thinking more about my research and less about that dresser. As evening approached, I changed into jeans and a sweater, pulling on my favorite green jacket, the one with multiple pockets for phone, wallet, pepper spray, Kate's insistence, and a small flashlight. I checked the weather. Still raining, but lighter now, more of a mist than a downpour. I ordered an Uber, not wanting to navigate unfamiliar bus routes in the dark. As I waited for the car, I felt a strange apprehension building. Not enough to make me cancel, but enough to notice. I checked the Craigslist messages again, looking for anything I might have missed. The profile had no history, no reviews. The username was generic, Boston Seller 22. No profile picture. Nothing particularly alarming, but nothing reassuring either. The Uber arrived, pulling me from my thoughts. I climbed in, giving the driver the address in Somerville. As we drove through the rainy streets of Boston, the city lights reflected in puddles and wet pavement, I rehearsed the usual Craigslist routine in my head. Examine the item. Be polite, but not overly friendly. Have cash ready. Don't linger unnecessarily. Simple enough. I'd done it dozens of times before. But something about this particular evening, this particular exchange, felt different. As we crossed the Charles River, leaving Boston proper and entering Cambridge, I had the distinct feeling I was crossing more than just a geographical boundary. Chapter 2. The House. The Uber dropped me off in front of a Victorian-style house on a quiet street lined with similar homes. Most had warm lights glowing from their windows, Halloween decorations still hanging from porches even though it was mid-November. Children's bicycles leaned against railings, recycling bins waited at curbs for morning collection, the normal detritus of suburban life. All except the house I stood before. From the outside, 478 Elm Street looked neglected, but not abandoned. The lawn was overgrown but not wild, the paint peeling but not severely so. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from a dim light somewhere deep within the house, barely visible through heavy curtains. No Halloween decorations here, no welcome mat, no potted plants, just a stark structure rising from the mist-slicked sidewalk. I stood a moment, taking it in. The house was set slightly back from its neighbors, with unkempt shrubs creating a natural barrier around the property. 2 massive oak trees flanked the front yard, their bare November branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the cloudy night sky. A wrought iron fence, its black paint chipped and flaking, surrounded the property. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet neighborhood. I hesitated at the gate, my finger hovering over the text I was supposed to send Kate. Something made me pause. I could still walk away, make up some excuse about changing my mind about the dresser. The Uber that had dropped me off was barely out of sight. I could call another, be home in 30 minutes, forget this whole thing. But I'd come all this way, and the thought of that walnut beauty in my bedroom pushed me forward. Plus, I wasn't about to admit to Kate that I'd gotten spooked by nothing more than an old house and some overgrown landscaping. I'd never hear the end of it. I sent the text to Kate, took a deep breath, and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. The mist had gotten heavier, clinging to my hair and jacket, giving everything a soft focus quality like an old photograph. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, with an underlying mustiness that seemed to emanate from the house itself. The front door was solid wood with a tarnished brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The windows to either side were covered with heavy drapes, allowing no glimpse inside. The porch boards creaked under my weight as I approached the door, the sound making me unreasonably tense. The doorbell didn't appear to work. The button was missing, leaving just a small hole where it should have been. I raised the knocker instead, letting it fall against the striking plate. The sound seemed to disappear into the house without echo, as if swallowed by something vast and empty. I waited, shifting my weight from foot to foot, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the cold November air bit through my jacket. Just as I was about to knock again, the door opened. Not fully, just enough to reveal a tall figure backlit by the dim interior light. I couldn't make out the person's features, just a silhouette taller than my 5'7" frame. "You're here for the dresser?" The voice was male, soft but with a gravelly undertone, as if rarely used. There was an educated quality to it, each word precisely enunciated. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound confident. "We spoke earlier. I'm Alex." The door opened wider, and the man stepped partially into view. He appeared to be in his 40s, with thinning, dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the dim light, making it difficult to see his eyes clearly. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a sharp jawline, giving him an austere appearance. His clothes were unremarkable, a button-down shirt and khaki pants that seemed slightly too large for his frame. His hands were long-fingered and surprisingly elegant, like those of a pianist or surgeon. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "It's in the back." Every alarm bell in my mind was ringing, but something stronger, curiosity perhaps, or stubborn determination, pushed me forward into the dimly lit hallway. As I crossed the threshold, I was enveloped by the peculiar atmosphere of the house, still air that smelled of old books, furniture polish, and something medicinal I couldn't quite identify. The interior of the house was not what I expected. Where the outside suggested neglect, the inside was meticulously organized. The hallway was lined with bookshelves containing hundreds of volumes arranged by size and color, creating an ombre effect that was clearly deliberate. Not a speck of dust was visible on any surface. The hardwood floors gleamed with recent polishing, and the brass fixtures had been buffed to a soft glow. "This way," he said, leading me deeper into the house. I followed, noting the unusual lack of personal photos or artwork on the walls. Instead, there were shadow boxes containing what appeared to be small objects, carefully arranged and labeled, though I couldn't read the labels in the dim light. I caught glimpses of what looked like ticket stubs, keychains, small pieces of jewelry, and other mundane items, each displayed with museum-like precision. The house was silent, except for our footsteps on the hardwood floors and the occasional creak of the old structure. No television sounds, no music, no hum of appliances, just silence and the sound of our movement through it. I found myself walking quietly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness that permeated the space. We passed a living room on the left, barely furnished with just a single armchair facing a fireplace. No television, no couch for guests. On the right was what might once have been a formal dining room, now empty, except for a desk positioned precisely in the center, its surface bare except for a closed laptop and a single notebook. "You have a lovely home," I said, wanting to break the uncomfortable silence. My voice sounded too loud, too intrusive. "It suits my needs," he replied without turning around. "I don't require much space." It was an odd response. The house was large, at least 3 bedrooms from what I could tell. Why would a single person need such a big place if they didn't require much space? And why keep it so empty? We continued down the hallway, passing a staircase that led to a second floor shrouded in darkness. I noticed there were no family photos, no personal touches anywhere. None of the accumulated clutter of a life being lived. Everything was intentional, placed with purpose. It felt more like a museum or a stage set than a home. "Do you collect antiques?" I asked, gesturing toward one of the shadow boxes as we passed. "In a manner of speaking," he replied cryptically, not elaborating further. The layout of the house became confusing as we moved deeper into it. What should have been a fairly straightforward floor plan seemed to contain unexpected turns and additional rooms that didn't make architectural sense from what I'd seen of the exterior. I began to lose my sense of direction, unsure now which way led back to the front door. "Just through here," he said, stopping before a door at the end of the hallway. He turned to face me fully for the first time, and I was struck by the intensity of his gaze now that I could see his eyes. They were pale blue, almost gray, and utterly focused, as if he were memorizing every detail of my appearance. "I should mention," he said, his voice still quiet but somehow more present, "I don't often have visitors. Please don't touch anything unless invited to do so." The request was reasonable for someone showing valuable antiques, but something in his tone made it sound more like a warning than a polite request. I nodded, suddenly very aware of my hands, which I slipped into my jacket pockets. He opened the door, revealing what appeared to be a converted solarium at the back of the house. The space was larger than I'd expected, with windows along 3 walls, though heavy curtains were drawn across them now. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was crowded with furniture and objects. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools and projects in various stages of completion. In the center of the room stood the walnut dresser from the listing, illuminated by a single overhead light that created a spotlight effect. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the dresser. "Take your time examining it." As I stepped into the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just walked into a trap of some kind, but the rational part of my brain dismissed the thought. He was just an eccentric collector, an introvert with unusual decorating preferences. Nothing to fear. How wrong I was. Chapter 3. The Cellar. "I'm Thomas," he said as we reached what appeared to be a dining room converted into a workspace. "I don't usually have visitors." His voice had a rehearsed quality to it now, as if he were reciting lines he'd spoken before. I wondered briefly how many people had heard these same words in this same room. The room contained several pieces of furniture, including the walnut dresser from the listing. It looked even better in person. The warm wood gleaming under the single overhead light, the brass handles polished to a soft glow. There wasn't a scratch on its surface, and the wood grain was exceptional. with whorls and patterns that spoke to the age and quality of the materials. "It's beautiful," I said, running my hand along the smooth top. "Is it really only $120? Thomas nodded, watching me intently. "I price things fairly. I'm not interested in profit." His gaze never left me as I inspected the dresser, opening each drawer to test how smoothly they moved, checking the joints and backs to ensure there was no damage. The craftsmanship was impeccable, and I found myself wondering again why he was selling such a piece for so little. I noticed then that the room contained more than just the dresser. There were several work tables arranged around the perimeter, each with different projects in various stages of completion. Some appeared to be furniture restoration, others more like art pieces or collections. One table held what looked like jewelry components, chains, beads, small metal findings arranged in clear plastic containers. Another had what appeared to be bookbinding tools and materials, leather scraps, thread, specialized tools I vaguely recognized from a craft workshop I'd attended years ago. "Are you a restorer?" I asked, trying to make conversation while examining the dresser's drawers. They slid smoothly, the dovetail joints tight and precise. "I'm a collector," Thomas replied, still standing by the doorway, "and a preservationist of sorts." Something about the way he said it made me look up. His gaze was fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. For the first time, I noticed how still he held himself. Not relaxed, but contained, like energy held in check. His hands were clasped in front of him, perfectly still. Even his breathing seemed measured, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt deliberate rather than natural. "What do you collect?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I continued inspecting the dresser, more to have something to focus on than out of any remaining concern about the furniture. "Moments," he said after a pause. "Memories, connections." I laughed nervously. "That sounds philosophical." He didn't laugh in return. Instead, he moved toward one of the work tables and picked up what looked like a small journal. His movements were fluid and precise, like someone who had complete awareness of their body in space. No wasted motion, no hesitation. "I believe that objects retain energy from the people who owned them," he said, running his finger along the journal's spine. "They carry histories, stories, emotions. Most people discard these things without a thought, but I see value in preserving them." I nodded, not sure how to respond to his earnestness. I'd met people with similar beliefs before, usually at the vintage markets or estate sales I frequented. There was something almost religious about the reverence some collectors had for objects with history. "Is that why you restore furniture?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my growing unease. "To preserve its history?" "The furniture is incidental," Thomas replied, setting the journal down exactly where it had been before. "A means to an end. What I'm really interested in is the connection between object and owner, the moment of transfer, the imprint people leave behind." As he spoke, I found myself drawn into his intensity despite myself. There was something compelling about his focus, his complete belief in what he was saying. It was as if he existed in his own reality, one with different rules and meanings than the world I knew. "Would you like some water?" he asked, abruptly changing the subject. "Or tea? I was about to make some for myself." I should have said no. I should have paid for the dresser and arranged for delivery another day. I should have listened to the unease growing in my stomach. But there was something about Thomas, an aura of certainty, of conviction, that made saying no feel somehow rude or dismissive. "Tea would be nice," I heard myself say instead. "Thank you." Thomas nodded and gestured toward a chair by one of the work tables. "Please sit. I'll be right back." As soon as he left the room, I pulled out my phone to text Kate. No signal. I moved around the room, holding my phone up, searching for bars. Nothing. I checked the time. I'd been in the house for 20 minutes. Kate would be expecting my text saying I was heading home soon. I considered leaving immediately but hesitated. I was being paranoid, surely. He was just a quiet, somewhat awkward guy who restored furniture and had some eccentric theories about objects and energy. The dresser was legitimately gorgeous and a steal at that price. I decided to wait for him to return, pay quickly, and arrange to pick up the dresser another time. While waiting, I took a closer look at the projects on the work tables. One held what appeared to be a half-completed shadow box, similar to those lining the hallway. A small velvet pad had been prepared, with pins ready to secure whatever object would be displayed. A label was already typed and waiting to be affixed. AJ, 11/14/2023, tomorrow's date. Something cold settled in the pit of my stomach. AJ, Alex Jenkins, my initials and tomorrow's date. I told myself it was a coincidence. AJ could be anyone, but combined with the no-cell signal, the isolated location, Thomas's strange intensity, my unease was rapidly transforming into fear. That's when I noticed the shadow boxes on the wall in this room were different from those in the hallway. These contained more personal items, a strand of hair carefully coiled in one, a worn movie ticket stub in another, a single earring in a third. Each had a small typewritten label with a date and what appeared to be initials. My eyes fell on one that contained a key ring with a small green plastic triangle attached to it. The label read SM 10/12/2022. My blood ran cold. 3 weeks ago, a Boston University graduate student named Sarah Mitchell had gone missing after going to look at an apartment she found online. The news had reported she was last seen at Porter Square Station, not far from here. Her keychain, described in the news reports, had a distinctive green triangle fob from her gym. I'd read about her case with particular interest, partly because she was also a graduate student, partly because I passed the missing person flyers with her face every day on campus. She'd been studying psychology too, though at BU rather than Northeastern. The police suspected she'd met with foul play but had no leads. And now her keychain, or one exactly like it, was mounted in a shadow box on this wall. I took an involuntary step backward, bumping into one of the work tables. A small tool, something like a leather awl, rolled off the edge and clattered to the floor. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet house. The floor creaked behind me. Chapter 4: The Collection. I turned slowly to find Thomas standing in the doorway, a tray with 2 steaming mugs in his hands and a placid expression on his face. If he noticed my distress, he gave no indication. His eyes flicked briefly to the fallen tool, then back to my face. "You're interested in my collection," he said. It wasn't a question. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I fought to keep my voice steady. "It's unique." "What does SM stand for?" Thomas set the tray down on a nearby table with deliberate care. The mugs were mismatched, one a plain white ceramic, the other a faded blue one with a chip on the rim. He took his time arranging them, positioning the handles at precisely the same angle before answering. People leave parts of themselves behind wherever they go: hair, skin cells, fingerprints, energy. But they also leave impressions, moments. I preserve them. He gestured around the room. Each of these items represents a connection, a moment when lives intersected. Most people don't appreciate these moments. They rush through them, discard them. I honor them. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure while frantically calculating the distance to the door. And SM? Was that a connection too? Thomas smiled slightly. It didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah was special, very observant, like you. She noticed my collection right away." My blood turned to ice. He just confirmed my worst fear. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my hands had begun to shake. I shoved them into my pockets to hide the tremor. "The tea is getting cold," he said, holding out a mug to me. "Chamomile. It's soothing." I didn't move to take it. What happened to Sarah Mitchell? Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening, a focus. She became part of something greater than herself. Most people live and die without leaving any real mark on the world. Their existence is ephemeral, forgotten within a generation. But Sarah will be preserved, remembered, honored in my collection. The way he spoke about her, in reverent tones but with complete detachment, sent chills down my spine. There was no malice in his voice, no anger or resentment, just a cold certainty that was far more terrifying than rage would have been. "I should go," I said, taking a step toward the doorway. "I just remembered I have an early meeting tomorrow." Thomas didn't move from his position, effectively blocking the exit. He was still holding the mug out to me, his arm perfectly steady. "But we haven't completed our transaction. You wanted the dresser." "I've changed my mind," I said, clutching my phone even though I knew it had no signal. "I can come back another time." "That's disappointing," Thomas said, setting down the mug he'd offered me. "I was hoping we could talk longer. I don't often find people who appreciate the value of preservation." His voice remained calm, measured, but there was an undercurrent of something dangerous now, a tension that hadn't been there before. I became acutely aware of how isolated we were, how unlikely it was that anyone would hear me if I screamed. "Maybe another time," I said, trying to keep my voice from betraying my fear. "I really do need to get going." As he spoke, I noticed something that had escaped my attention before. Behind him, partially visible through the doorway to what must have been the kitchen, was a wall covered with Polaroid photographs. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, arranged in a precise grid. From where I stood, I could make out that they were portraits, face after face staring out from the wall. Thomas noticed the direction of my gaze and turned slightly. "Ah, you've noticed my memory wall. Would you like to see it?" Each photograph captures the exact moment when someone understood the importance of what I do. I could just make out the expressions in the nearest photos, not smiling vacation snapshots or posed portraits, but faces frozen in expressions of realization, of fear, of understanding. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline was beginning to course through my veins. "I think you would make an excellent addition," Thomas continued, his voice still eerily calm. "You have an appreciation for history, for things that carry stories. Your reaction to the dresser showed me that." He took a step toward me. "I've been watching you for a while, Alex. I've seen you at estate sales at the vintage market in Sowa. You treat objects with respect. You understand their value." The realization that he had been stalking me hit like a physical blow. My mind raced through all the times I'd felt watched over the past few months, the strange coincidences of seeing the same faces in different places. Had that been him? Had he been following me, studying me, selecting me all this time? "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "To preserve this moment," Thomas replied, reaching into his pocket. "The moment when understanding dawns. It's always unique, always genuine. No one can fake that reaction." His hand emerged holding a small syringe, its contents clear. He looked at it with something like reverence. "This won't hurt," he said softly. "It's a simple sedative. When you wake up, you'll be part of something eternal. Your essence will be preserved, honored. Isn't that what everyone wants? To be remembered?" My mind raced through options. The doorway was blocked. The windows were likely locked, and even if I broke one, we were at the back of the house, far from the street or neighbors. Screaming might not help. The house seemed well insulated, the nearest neighbor not particularly close. That left fighting or reasoning. Thomas, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, you don't need to do this. I understand what you're trying to achieve. The preservation of moments, of connections. It's beautiful, really. I was buying time, looking around for anything I could use as a weapon. The leather awl that had fallen to the floor was too far away, but there was a heavy brass lamp on the work table behind me. Most people don't understand, Thomas said, taking another step toward me. They think I'm a monster, but I'm a curator, an archivist of human experience. I can see that, I said, edging backward toward the table with the lamp. Your collection is impressive, meticulous. It shows real dedication. Something like pleasure flickered across his face. Yes, exactly. It's taken years to perfect my techniques, the preservation methods for different materials, the cataloging system. Everything must be precise. How do you choose? I asked, genuinely curious despite my fear. Your subjects, I mean. Thomas seemed pleased by the question. I observe. I watch for people who show awareness, appreciation for the history of objects, people who understand that things carry energy, memories. Not everyone deserves preservation. Most people are too shallow, too transient in their connections. As he spoke, his focus shifted from immediate threat to explaining his philosophy. His grip on the syringe relaxed slightly as he gesticulated with his other hand. I selected you weeks ago, he continued, at the estate sale in Brookline. You spent 10 minutes examining a single bookmark, not for its monetary value, but for the notes written in the margin of the page it marked. You understood that the real value was in the connection to the person who had left those notes. I remembered the moment he was describing, an estate sale at the home of a retired English professor. I'd found a volume of Yeats with a faded ribbon bookmark placed at "When You Are Old." In the margin were faint pencil marks, a heart, the initials E+J. I'd imagined a love story there, wondered about E and J and who had gifted the book to whom. You have the soul of a preservationist, Thomas said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. That's why you deserve a place in my collection. Not everyone does. How many? I asked, my hand now resting on the table behind me, inches from the lamp. How many are in your collection? Thomas smiled, a genuine expression of pride. 43. You'll be 44. A good number. Balanced. Symmetrical. The casualness with which he mentioned 43 victims sent a wave of nausea through me. 43 people, reduced to keepsakes and shadow boxes and expressions of fear and Polaroids. And what will you take from me? I asked, fingers closing around the base of the lamp. What will represent me in your collection? That's part of the process, Thomas explained, taking another step closer. I observe, I learn what's meaningful. For Sarah, it was her keychain, the gift from her brother before he died in Afghanistan. For others, it might be a piece of jewelry, a ticket stub from a significant event, a lock of hair, something that captures their essence. His clinical detachment was perhaps the most terrifying thing about him. There was no rage driving him, no sadness or trauma he was trying to process through violence. Just a cold, methodical belief in his own twisted philosophy. And the photographs? I asked, stalling further. Those capture the moment of understanding, the precise second when someone realizes they're becoming part of something greater than themselves. It's the purest expression of a person's true nature. Fear strips away all pretense, all social masks. As he spoke, Thomas raised the syringe slightly, examining it in the light. This is a special blend. It paralyzes, but keeps consciousness intact. I need you awake for the photograph, need to capture that moment of transcendence. Chapter 5, The Escape. What happened next occurred in a blur of instinct and terror. As Thomas stepped forward with the syringe raised, I grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the work table and swung it with all my strength. It connected with his arm, causing him to drop the syringe. He let out a startled cry of pain that quickly transformed into rage. His previously calm demeanor shattered completely. "No!" he shouted, lunging for me. "You don't understand. You're supposed to be part of the collection." The look in his eyes was transformative, from detached observer to predatory fury in an instant. The mask of civility dropped away completely, revealing something inhuman beneath. His face contorted with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed. I dodged his grasp and ran for the doorway, knocking over one of the work tables in my path to slow him down. The crash of objects hitting the floor was deafening in the previously quiet house. Tools, shadow box materials, and half-completed projects scattered across the hardwood. "My work," Thomas howled, his voice cracking with anguish as he saw his carefully arranged materials strewn across the floor. I sprinted down the hallway, knocking shadow boxes from the walls as I went, hoping to create obstacles behind me. Glass shattered, and I heard Thomas's howl of anguish as his precious memories scattered across the floor. "Those are irreplaceable," he screamed, his voice distorted with fury. "Do you know what you've done?" The front door seemed miles away, though it was only a short hallway. As I ran, my foot caught on an antique rug, sending me stumbling into the wall. I caught myself before falling completely, but lost precious seconds regaining my balance. Behind me, I could hear Thomas recovering from his initial shock and pursuing me. His footsteps were measured, controlled even in his rage. Not the frantic running I expected, but a steady, implacable pursuit. Somehow that was more terrifying, the certainty in his movement, the confidence that I couldn't escape. As I approached the front of the house, I noticed something I'd missed on my way in. A small table near the entrance held a neat row of cell phones, at least a dozen of them. Various models, some newer, some older, all arranged by size, with the same precision Thomas showed in all his displays. How many people had he lured here? How many had tried to call for help with those phones? I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, my fingers slipping in panic. It was an old-fashioned deadbolt that required a key, which wasn't in the lock. I frantically searched the nearby surfaces, knocking over a small dish of coins in the process. "There's nowhere to go, Alex," Thomas called from behind me, his voice calmer now but filled with certainty. "The doors are locked. The windows are reinforced. This house was designed for my work." My eyes darted frantically around the entryway. The deadbolt needed a key. No sign of it on any nearby surface. The panic rising in my chest threatened to overwhelm me, but my forensic psychology training kicked in. Focus on solutions, not problems. Evaluate options quickly. Act decisively. A heavy brass umbrella stand stood by the door. I grabbed it and swung it against the window beside the door. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. Some kind of security glass. I swung again, harder, and this time the window broke, creating a jagged opening large enough to climb through. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, now only meters away. His face was a mask of fury, but his movements remained controlled, methodical. He held another syringe in his hand, a backup, prepared and ready. "You're destroying history." I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the broken window, feeling glass tear at my jacket and slice my hand. The pain was sharp but distant, overwhelmed by adrenaline. I landed awkwardly on the porch, stumbled, but managed to keep my footing. Behind me, Thomas was climbing through the window with surprising agility for his age. His face was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, but he seemed oblivious to it. His eyes remained fixed on me, utterly focused on his prey. "You were supposed to be perfect," he said, his voice quavering with emotion now. "I chose you specifically. Watched you for weeks. You understand preservation. You respect history." I didn't waste time responding. I vaulted over the porch railing rather than taking the steps, landing hard on the wet grass below. My ankle twisted, sending a sharp pain up my leg, but I pushed through it, limping as fast as I could toward the street. Thomas was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps on the gravel path, steady and determined. Not rushing, not panicking, just pursuing with absolute confidence that he would catch me. "This isn't how it's supposed to happen," he called after me. His voice was sad now, disappointed. The process should be dignified, respectful. Now it's all ruined, chaotic. I reached the wrought iron gate and shoved it open, the rusty hinges shrieking in protest. The street beyond was still quiet, no pedestrians, no passing cars. The mist had thickened into a light rain again, reducing visibility and muffling sounds. I turned left and ran as fast as my injured ankle would allow, away from Porter Square, toward what I hoped would be a busier street. Behind me, I heard the gate clang shut. Thomas was still following, but no longer calling out to me. The silence was somehow more terrifying than his ranting. My mind raced through options. The rain made it unlikely anyone would be out walking. Screaming might bring someone to a window, but by the time they understood what was happening, it could be too late. I needed to find people, lights, safety. I glanced back and saw Thomas still following, now only about 20 meters behind me. His pace was steady, unhurried. He wasn't even breathing hard. He looked almost serene again, his initial fury replaced by determination. He knew these streets better than I did, knew where I might go. His hand was in his pocket, likely clutching the syringe. As I approached an intersection, I saw the blessed sight of headlights approaching, a car turning onto the street. Without hesitation, I lurched into the road, waving my arms frantically. The car swerved, honking loudly, and came to a stop just short of hitting me. "Help!" I screamed, slapping my palms on the hood of the car. "Please help me!" The driver's window rolled down, revealing a startled middle-aged couple. The man behind the wheel looked annoyed, then concerned as he took in my disheveled appearance, the blood on my hand and face. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. "I could have killed you." "Please," I gasped, looking back to see Thomas slowing his pace, stopping at the corner. "A man is chasing me. He's dangerous. Please, I need to get away from here." The woman in the passenger seat was already unlocking the back door. "Get in," she said, her voice firm. "Mark, let her in." I scrambled into the back seat, slamming the door behind me and locking it immediately. Through the window, I could see Thomas standing motionless on the corner, watching. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with intensity even from that distance. "That man there?" Mark asked, nodding toward Thomas. "The tall guy in the button-down?" "Yes," I said, my voice shaking. He tried to drug me. He has others, people missing, in his house. Please, we need to call the police." The woman was already dialing 911 on her phone. "We have reception," she said, giving me a strange look. "He blocks the signal somehow," I explained, realizing how paranoid I sounded. "In his house. Please, we need to leave. Now, he might have a weapon." Mark didn't need to be told twice. He pulled away from the curb, accelerating perhaps faster than necessary. Through the rear window, I watched Thomas standing perfectly still, watching the car drive away. He made no attempt to pursue, no dramatic gesture. He simply stood there, a solitary figure growing smaller in the distance, illuminated by the streetlight above him. "My name's Carol," the woman said, turning in her seat to look at me. "This is my husband, Mark. We've got you now. You're safe." Her words broke something in me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the escape began to ebb, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. Tears welled in my eyes and a sob escaped my throat. "Thank you," I managed to whisper. "Thank you." The police arrived quickly. My statement was taken, and officers were dispatched to the house on Elm Street. But by the time they arrived, Thomas was gone. The house was empty of any people, though the evidence of my escape, the overturned table, the shattered shadow boxes, the broken front window, remained. The collection was gone too. No shadow boxes of keepsakes, no wall of Polaroids, no phones on the entry table. Just the walnut dresser sitting innocuously in the dining room, exactly as advertised. The house, they discovered, had been rented 6 months earlier by a Thomas Garrett. The landlord had never met him in person. All transactions had been handled electronically. The ID he'd provided turned out to be stolen from a man who had died 3 years earlier. Forensic teams found traces of multiple DNA samples throughout the house, some matching missing persons cases from across 3 states, including Sarah Mitchell's. But Thomas himself seemed to have vanished. In the days that followed, I worked with a police sketch artist to create a composite of Thomas's face. My training in observation and memory techniques helped, and the resulting image was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. I spent hours looking through missing persons cases, trying to match potential victims to what I had seen in Thomas's collection. The FBI became involved after evidence linked Thomas to disappearances in multiple states. They believed he'd been operating for years, possibly decades, moving from city to city, leaving a trail of missing persons that had never been connected until now. I couldn't return to my apartment alone. Kate stayed with me for weeks, sleeping on an air mattress beside my bed. I jumped at every sound, checked the locks multiple times each night, and couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My professors gave me extensions on assignments, and the university provided free counseling services, but nothing seemed to help with the constant fear. In the weeks that followed, I learned I wasn't his first target in Boston, and the authorities now suspect I wasn't his last. 3 more people have disappeared after responding to online marketplace listings since that night. Each time, the seller's description and modus operandi are slightly different, adapted to avoid detection. The FBI agent assigned to the case, a serious woman named Agent Rivera, became a regular presence in my life. She updated me on developments, asked follow-up questions as new evidence emerged, and eventually delivered the news I had been dreading. "We believe he's moved on," she told me over coffee one morning, 3 months after my encounter. "The pattern suggests he never stays in one location after being compromised. He's meticulous about leaving no trace." "So he's just gone? Free to start again somewhere else?" I asked, the unfairness of it burning in my chest. "For now," Agent Rivera said, her jaw tight with determination. "But we know more about him than ever before. Thanks to you, we have a face, a methodology, a psychological profile. We've connected cases that were previously seen as isolated incidents. It's only a matter of time." But her reassurances rang hollow. Thomas was still out there, still collecting, still preserving his twisted memories of fear and violation. "I don't shop on Craigslist anymore. I don't go to estate sales or browse antique shops. My apartment remains half-furnished, and I've grown to prefer it that way. Clean, minimal, with nothing that holds memories I didn't create myself." I transferred to an online program to complete my degree, unable to face the daily journey to campus, the possibility of seeing a familiar pair of wire-rimmed glasses in a crowd. My research focus changed too. I now specialize in the psychology of collectors who become killers, those who objectify humans, who preserve mementos of their victims. My professors see it as academic interest. My therapist recognizes it as an attempt to process trauma through intellectual understanding. Both are partly right, but there's another motivation they don't know about. I'm hunting him too, in my own way. Building a profile, tracking patterns in similar cases, creating a database of incidents that match his methodology. Agent Rivera sends me redacted case files occasionally, knowing my academic interest provides cover for continued involvement. We both know it's unorthodox, possibly inappropriate, But the shared determination to find Thomas creates an alliance that transcends normal protocol. Sometimes at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining Thomas out there somewhere, arranging a new collection in a new city. And I wonder what item he would have chosen to remember me by. What small piece of my existence would have been preserved in one of his meticulous shadow boxes, labeled with my initials and the date of my disappearance. What terrifies me most isn't that he's still out there. It's that somewhere, in some new house with new shadow boxes lining the walls, he might already have something of mine, something I unknowingly left behind during one of those times I felt watched but saw nothing. A strand of hair perhaps, or a receipt I dropped, or maybe just a photograph taken from a distance, preserving the moment before I understood what kind of collector Thomas really was. 3 days ago, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address, just my name printed in precise block letters. Inside was a small, perfectly polished brass lamp pull, identical to the one on the lamp I had used to strike Thomas and escape. Attached was a note on expensive stationery. The collection remains incomplete. Preservation is patient. I've moved again since then, changed my name, withdrawn from my program. Agent Rivera arranged protective surveillance, but we both know it can't last forever. Resources are limited, and without concrete evidence of an imminent threat, the Bureau can only do so much. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my new apartment, and the light hits just right, I catch a glimpse of the shadow where that walnut dresser would have stood, and I wonder if Thomas is also looking at that same empty space in his mind, planning how to fill it, planning for the day when his collection will finally be complete. I never wanted to go to Montana. The idea of spending my summer break in the middle of nowhere seemed like a punishment rather than a vacation. But when my college roommate Dylan invited me to his family's cabin near Glacier National Park, something about the earnestness in his voice made it hard to say no. "Trust me, Alex," he said, his eyes lighting up. "The mountains there will change you. My family's place is remote, but that's what makes it special." I had planned to intern at a marketing firm in Chicago, building my resume before senior year. But after 3 years of constant grinding, classes, part-time jobs, networking events, I was exhausted. Maybe I did need a break from the endless chase. "No cell service for miles," Dylan continued. "Just wilderness, a few hiking trails, and the clearest night sky you've ever seen." The thought of disconnecting was both terrifying and appealing. No emails, no social media, no constant notifications, just open space and silence. "Who else is coming?" I asked. "Just us and my cousin Mia. She's flying in from Seattle." I'd seen pictures of Mia on Dylan's Instagram. She looked athletic and outdoorsy, with sun-kissed skin and a confident smile. Not that it mattered. I had sworn off relationships after the disaster with Emma last semester. Still, 3 weeks in a cabin with good company didn't sound terrible. "Fine," I said finally. "But if I get eaten by a bear, I'm blaming you." Dylan laughed, slapping me on the shoulder. "The bears are the least of your worries out there," he said, and something in his tone made me pause. But then he was grinning again, and the moment passed so quickly, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Kalispell, Montana, staring out the window as endless pine forests and jagged mountains came into view. I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread settle in my stomach. I had never been one for outdoor adventures. The wilderness was Dylan's element, not mine. He'd grown up hiking and fishing, while I'd barely left Chicago except for family vacations to Florida. As the plane descended, I pulled out the small journal I'd brought along, another of Dylan's suggestions. "You'll want to remember everything," he'd said. I opened to the first blank page and wrote the date, followed by a single line. I hope I'm not making a mistake. Little did I know how prophetic those words would prove to be. The Kalispell Airport was tiny compared to O'Hare. I stepped off the plane into mountain air so crisp it felt like biting into an apple. Dylan was waiting in the small terminal, lounging against a wall with the easy confidence I'd always envied. Next to him stood a young woman I recognized as Mia, somehow even more striking in person than in photos. "Alex," Dylan called, wrapping me in a bear hug. "Welcome to Big Sky Country." Mia offered a warm smile and a handshake. "Nice to finally meet you. Dylan talks about you all the time." "Only the good parts, I hope," I said, immediately cringing at how awkward I sounded. We loaded my bags into Dylan's weather-beaten Jeep and headed into town for supplies. The local grocery store was well stocked but had none of the brands I was used to seeing. Dylan and Mia expertly filled carts with provisions while I trailed behind, feeling out of place among the flannel-wearing locals who all seemed to know each other. "We need to stock up," Dylan explained. "Once we're at the cabin, it's a good hour drive back to town." I nodded, suddenly realizing how isolated we would be. As we checked out, I noticed a bulletin board near the exit covered with missing person flyers. Most featured hikers who had ventured into the national park and never returned. I stared at their smiling faces as Dylan loaded groceries into the Jeep. "Does this happen often?" I asked, gesturing toward the board. The cashier, an older woman with weathered skin, followed my gaze. "The mountains don't forgive mistakes," she said matter-of-factly. "People come out here thinking nature is like some kind of theme park. It's not." "Don't worry," Mia interjected, appearing at my side. "We know the area well." As we drove away from town, the landscape grew increasingly wild. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt tracks that made the Jeep bounce violently. Dense forests pressed in from both sides, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking views of distant peaks. After nearly an hour of driving, Dylan turned onto a barely visible trail between two massive pines. "Almost there," he announced. The cabin finally came into view as we rounded a bend. It was larger than I'd expected. A two-story structure of weathered logs with a wide porch and large windows. Behind it rose a steep, forested hillside that eventually became a mountain. "What do you think?" Dylan asked, killing the engine. "It's remote," I managed, taking in our surroundings. "Been in the family for generations," he said proudly, getting out. "My great-grandfather built it himself." As we unloaded supplies, I noticed a narrow trail leading from behind the cabin into the dense woods. "Where does that go?" I asked. Dylan and Mia exchanged a quick glance I couldn't interpret. "Just an old hunting trail," Dylan said casually. "Doesn't really go anywhere interesting. We'll stick to the marked trails when we hike." That night, after a dinner of grilled steaks and cold beer, we sat on the porch watching stars emerge in a sky so vast it made me dizzy. The darkness around us was absolute, broken only by the warm glow from the cabin windows and our small fire pit. The distant howl of what might have been a wolf sent a shiver down my spine. "You get used to it," Mia said, noticing my reaction. "The wilderness has its own language. You just have to learn to listen." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to understand what it was saying. As Dylan and Mia chatted easily about previous summers spent here, I found myself drawn to the edge of the porch, staring into the wall of darkness where the forest began. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting between trees, but when I blinked, there was nothing. That night, in the small upstairs bedroom Dylan had given me, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. The old cabin creaked and settled. Wind whispered through pine needles. Something small scurried across the roof. Just before sleep finally claimed me, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the trail behind the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, moving away from the house and into the forest. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound had already faded into the night. Probably just an animal, I told myself. But as I drifted off to sleep, the uneasy feeling remained. The first few days passed pleasantly enough. We hiked well-established trails, fished in a crystal-clear lake about a mile from the cabin, and spent evenings playing cards by the fire. Dylan was a patient teacher, showing me how to cast a fishing line and identify various animal tracks. Mia, I learned, worked as an environmental scientist in Seattle and knew the names of every plant and bird we encountered. I began to relax, falling into the rhythm of days dictated by sunrise and sunset, rather than deadlines and notifications. My initial anxiety about being disconnected faded. Instead, I found myself sleeping better than I had in years, lulled by the profound silence that descended each night. On our fourth morning, I woke early and decided to let Dylan and Mia sleep in while I enjoyed coffee on the porch. The sun was just beginning to illuminate the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. As I sipped my coffee, movement at the forest edge caught my eye. A man stood at the tree line, partially hidden by a pine trunk. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in faded outdoor clothing that blended with the forest. I raised a hand in greeting, assuming he must be a hiker passing through the area, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. When Dylan joined me an hour later, I mentioned the stranger. "Probably just someone from one of the other cabins," he said, though he frowned slightly. "There are a few properties scattered around, though none as close as to be neighbors." "Should we be concerned?" "Nah," Dylan said, but I noticed him scanning the tree line. "People come out here for privacy. They usually keep to themselves." After breakfast, we decided to hike to a waterfall Mia wanted to photograph. As we prepared our day packs, I found myself glancing repeatedly toward where I'd seen the man, but there was no sign of him. The hike was challenging, but rewarding. The waterfall cascaded nearly 100 feet down a series of rock ledges, creating a perpetual mist that nourished an explosion of wildflowers. While Mia set up her camera equipment, Dylan and I perched on boulders near the pool at the base of the falls. "So, what's the story with that trail behind the cabin?" I asked casually. Dylan skipped a stone across the water. "Just an old trail. Nobody uses it much anymore." "Your dad's cabin, but you don't use all the trails?" He hesitated. "My dad actually doesn't come out here much. He and my grandfather had a falling out years ago. The cabin technically belongs to my uncle now, but he lets us use it." "What was the falling out about?" Dylan shrugged, suddenly interested in finding another stone to throw. "Family stuff. Not important." Before I could press further, Mia called us over to see her photographs. The moment passed, but Dylan seemed quieter on the hike back. That evening, while Mia was showering, I helped Dylan prepare dinner. As I chopped vegetables, I noticed an old photo hanging in the kitchen I hadn't paid attention to before. A black and white image of several men standing in front of the cabin, rifles in hand, with what appeared to be a large deer carcass at their feet. "Your family?" I asked. Dylan glanced up. "Yeah, that's my grandfather on the left, my dad next to him. The other two were my grandfather's brothers." I stepped closer to examine the photo. The men weren't smiling. Despite the apparent hunting success, there was something tense in their postures, particularly between the man Dylan had identified as his father and the oldest man, presumably his grandfather. "They don't look too happy for a successful hunt." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "That was the last time my dad came here, summer of '87. There was something in his voice that discouraged further questions, so I returned to chopping vegetables. Later, as we ate dinner, I noticed Dylan and Mia exchanging glances whenever the conversation drifted toward the cabin's history or the surrounding woods. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, causing tree branches to scrape against my window. Around 2 a.m., I got up for a glass of water. The cabin was dark, but moonlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. As I passed the living room window, I froze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the cabin. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was the same man I'd seen that morning. He stood perfectly still, as if watching the cabin. As my eyes adjusted, I realized he was standing at the entrance to that unused trail behind the cabin. I was about to wake Dylan when the man turned and walked into the forest, disappearing down the trail. I remained by the window for nearly an hour, but he didn't return. In the morning, I found fresh footprints in the soft earth where the man had stood. When I pointed them out to Dylan, his face darkened. "We should stay away from that trail," he said firmly. "Why? Who was that guy?" Dylan hesitated, then sighed. "Look, there's an old hermit who lives further up the mountain. He's harmless, but prefers to be left alone. The trail leads toward his territory. It's best not to intrude." The explanation seemed reasonable, but something about Dylan's tense expression made me wonder if he was telling the whole truth. As we walked back to the cabin, I noticed Mia watching us with concern. That day, we drove into town for more supplies. While Dylan filled the Jeep with gas, I wandered into the small local museum, curious about the area's history. The elderly docent was eager to share stories about the early settlers and mining operations. When I mentioned we were staying in a cabin near the North Ridge, her smile faltered. "The Thompson place?" she asked. "I think so. It belongs to my friend's uncle now." She nodded slowly. "Beautiful area, though there's quite a history there." I waited for her to continue, but she seemed to catch herself, changing the subject to the annual town festival. As I was leaving, however, she touched my arm. "Be careful in those woods," she said quietly. "Stick to the marked trails." It was the second warning about the trails, and it left me with an unsettled feeling that lasted the rest of the day. Our second week began with a storm that kept us cabin-bound for 2 days. Rain hammered the roof while wind howled through the pines like a living thing. Inside, we played cards, read books from the cabin's well-stocked shelves, and took turns cooking elaborate meals. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally broke. We emerged from the cabin to find the forest transformed. Vibrant greens intensified by moisture, mushrooms sprouting where none had been before, and the air charged with the scent of wet earth and pine. "Perfect day for exploring," Dylan declared. "I thought we could hike up to Eagle Point. The view after a rain is incredible." We set out after breakfast, following a trail that wound steeply upward through the forest. The ground was slick with mud and fallen leaves, making the climb challenging. About an hour in, we paused at a small clearing to catch our breath. "How much further?" I asked, wiping sweat from my forehead despite the cool air. "Another hour maybe," Dylan replied. "It gets steeper, but it's worth it." As we rested, I wandered to the edge of the clearing and noticed what appeared to be another trail branching off from our path. Unlike the maintained trail we were following, this one was overgrown, barely visible among the underbrush. "Hey, where does this go?" I called. Dylan and Mia exchanged a quick look before Dylan answered. "Nowhere important, probably an old game trail. Let's stick to the main path." I nodded, but something about their reaction piqued my curiosity. It was the same tension I'd noticed whenever the trail behind the cabin was mentioned. We continued our hike, eventually reaching Eagle Point, a rocky outcropping that offered a spectacular view of the valley below and mountains beyond. While Dylan and Mia set up a small picnic, I explored the edge of the viewpoint. taking photos with my phone even though I had no signal to share them. As I framed a shot of a distant lake, I noticed something odd in the valley below. What appeared to be a structure of some kind, partially hidden among the trees. It was difficult to make out details from this distance, but it didn't look like a natural formation. "What's that down there?" I asked, pointing. Dylan came to stand beside me, squinting in the direction I indicated. His body tensed subtly. "Hard to say from here," he replied too casually. "Probably just an old ranger station or fire lookout." "Can we hike to it?" "No established trail," he said quickly. "Pretty rough terrain, not worth the effort." I let the subject drop, but my suspicions were growing. There was something in these woods that Dylan didn't want me to know about. Something connected to that unused trail and possibly to his family's history with the cabin. That evening, while Dylan and Mia were preparing dinner, I slipped out to the porch with the excuse of wanting to watch the sunset. Once there, I pulled out my journal and quickly sketched a rough map of the area based on what I'd observed, marking the cabin, the trails we'd hiked, and the approximate location of the structure I'd spotted from Eagle Point. Looking at my crude drawing, I realized that the unused trail behind the cabin likely led in that direction. Dinner was a subdued affair. The day's hiking had left us all tired, and conversation was minimal. I noticed Dylan checking the locks on the doors and windows before we turned in for the night, something he hadn't done before. "Expecting trouble?" I asked lightly. "Just a precaution," he said. "Animals get bolder after storms, looking for food." I nodded as if I believed him, but the knot of unease in my stomach tightened. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. The storm had stirred something in the wilderness, or perhaps in me. I could no longer ignore the feeling that we were not alone out here, and that Dylan was keeping secrets. Around midnight, I heard it again, footsteps on the trail behind the cabin. This time, they weren't moving away into the forest, but coming toward the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the clearing behind the cabin. For several minutes, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow detached itself from the tree line, the same gaunt figure I'd seen before, moving with surprising silence toward the cabin. He stopped about 20 yards from the building and simply stood there, face tilted upward as if examining the windows. I was certain he couldn't see me in the darkness of my room, but a chill ran through me nonetheless. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned and melted back into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I waited until Mia went for her usual solo morning jog before confronting Dylan. "Who was really out there?" I demanded, showing him my journal with the map I'd drawn. "And don't tell me it's just some harmless hermit. He was watching the cabin last night." Dylan's face paled. "You saw him again?" "Yes, and I'm pretty sure that trail leads to whatever structure I saw from Eagle Point." "What aren't you telling me, Dylan?" He sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "It's complicated, Alex. Family history I didn't want to get into. I think I deserve to know, especially if there's someone out there watching us." Dylan ran a hand through his hair, his usual confidence gone. "That trail leads to my grandfather's old hunting cabin. The main property was divided after a dispute. My dad got this cabin, his brother got the other one." "And the man I've been seeing?" "Probably my uncle. He was always odd. After my grandfather died, he became increasingly reclusive. Lives up there year-round now. My dad says he's harmless, just antisocial, but they haven't spoken in years." The explanation was plausible, but something still felt off. Why all the secrecy? Why not just tell me this from the beginning? Dylan looked away. "Because the dispute wasn't just about property. There were accusations, things my father believed my uncle was involved in. What kind of accusations? Before Dylan could answer, the front door burst open. Mia stood there, breathless and pale, her jogging clothes muddy and torn. "You need to see this," she gasped. "I found something on the trail." Mia led us along her jogging path, a loop trail that circled away from the cabin and rejoined the main road about a mile away. She moved with urgency, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. "I veered off the main trail," she explained as we walked. "There was a deer path I wanted to explore. That's when I found it." "Found what?" I asked, but she just shook her head and kept walking. After about 20 minutes, she stopped and pointed to a barely visible track leading deeper into the woods. "Through there." Dylan hesitated. "Mia, maybe we should." "He needs to know," she interrupted. "We all do." We followed the narrow path until it opened into a small clearing. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just a patch of open ground surrounded by dense pines. Then Mia pointed to a spot where the earth had been recently disturbed. "I tripped over something," she said quietly. "Started to uncover this." She knelt and brushed away some soil and pine needles, revealing what appeared to be a piece of fabric. Dylan's breath hitched. "We should go back," he said, his voice strained. "We should call the ranger station." But Mia continued clearing debris, and soon we could see that the fabric was part of a backpack, weathered and dirty, but relatively recent. Next to it lay a hiking boot, and protruding from beneath more soil was something that made my stomach lurch, what appeared to be a human bone. "Stop," Dylan said sharply, pulling Mia back. "Don't touch anything else." I stared at the partial excavation, my mind racing. Is this a grave? Dylan's face had gone ashen. "We need to go back to the cabin, now. We'll call for help from the emergency radio." As we hurriedly retraced our steps, I noticed Dylan repeatedly looking toward the direction of that forbidden trail, the one leading to his uncle's cabin. "This is what your dad accused your uncle of, isn't it?" I asked, the pieces suddenly falling into place. "Those missing hikers on the bulletin board in town." Dylan didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Back at the cabin, Dylan retrieved an emergency radio from a locked cabinet and attempted to contact the ranger station. The response was immediate. They would send a team, but it would take at least 2 hours to reach our location. "We need to lock the doors and wait," Dylan said, his voice shaking slightly. "Don't go outside until help arrives." "Your uncle," I said, facing him directly. "He's been watching us because he knows we might discover what he's done." Dylan sank into a chair. I never believed the stories were true. My dad used to say Uncle Robert had episodes, that he would disappear into the woods for days and come back different, but I thought it was just part of their feud. The falling out in '87, I remembered. What really happened? Dylan looked up, his eyes haunted. "A hiker went missing that summer. Dad found evidence in Uncle Robert's cabin, a camera that belonged to the missing man. He confronted him, but Uncle Robert denied everything, said he found the camera on a trail. After that, Dad refused to come back here." "Then why did you bring us here?" I demanded, anger rising through my fear. "If you suspected any of this might be true?" "I didn't," Dylan protested. "Uncle Robert moved to his cabin permanently 10 years ago. He's barely been seen since. I thought the worst of his mental issues had passed, that he was just a recluse now." Maya, who had been silent since our return, suddenly spoke up. "The footprints Alex saw. If that was your uncle watching the cabin..." She didn't need to finish the thought. We all glanced nervously at the windows, now acutely aware of how exposed we were despite the locked doors. "The Rangers will be here soon," Dylan said, checking his watch. "We just need to stay calm and wait." But as the minutes crawled by, the cabin seemed to shrink around us. Every creak of the structure, every whisper of wind through the trees outside made us flinch. I found myself obsessively checking the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. An hour passed, then another. The radio remained silent except for an occasional status update from the ranger team. They were still en route, delayed by difficult terrain. As the afternoon light began to fade, Mia suddenly gripped my arm. "The back door," she whispered. We all turned to see the handle of the rear door slowly turning. Dylan had locked it. I had watched him do it, but there was unmistakable movement. Dylan motioned for us to move back, reaching for a hunting rifle mounted on the wall. He checked that it was loaded, his hands trembling slightly. The door handle stopped moving. For a moment, there was perfect silence. Then came a light knocking. 3 gentle taps that somehow seemed more terrifying than any violent pounding would have been. "Anthony Robert?" Dylan called, his voice surprisingly steady. "The Rangers are on their way. We found the grave." No response, just the vast silence of the wilderness pressing in around us. Then a voice came, soft, almost conversational, drifting through the door like a wisp of smoke. "You shouldn't have come back, Dylan. This place was never meant for your father's family. You know that." Dylan's knuckles whitened around the rifle. "What did you do, Uncle Robert?" A low chuckle from the other side of the door. "Only what needed to be done. Only what this land demanded." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The voice continued, dreamy and distant. "They were trespassers, all of them, just like you 3. Another silence followed, heavier than before. Then the voice came again, closer to the door. "I've watched you since you arrived, waited to see if you would find your way to the old trail, to the truth." Dylan raised the rifle, aiming at the door. "Stay back," he warned. "The Rangers will be here any minute." "The Rangers won't make it before dark," the voice replied with unsettling certainty. "No one ever does." I heard movement, not at the door, but at the front of the cabin. Footsteps on the porch. Whoever was speaking to us wasn't alone. "Dylan," I whispered urgently, "there's someone else." Before he could respond, there was a crash from the living room, the sound of breaking glass. Mia screamed as a rock sailed through the window, landing on the floor amid shards of glass. "He's trying to get in," Dylan said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to barricade the doors and windows." We moved quickly, dragging furniture against the doors and pulling curtains closed over the windows. Outside, the light was fading rapidly, the forest disappearing into shadow. The radio crackled to life. The ranger team reporting they were still 40 minutes out. Dylan acknowledged the transmission, keeping his voice low as he updated them on our situation. "Help is coming," he assured us. "We just need to hold out a little longer." But as twilight deepened into dusk, the cabin seemed increasingly fragile against the wilderness surrounding it. The knocking had stopped, but occasional sounds from outside, a snapped twig, the scrape of something against the wall, told us we were still being watched, still being hunted. In the deepening gloom, I suddenly remembered the photo in the kitchen. Those grim-faced men with their rifles and their secrets. How many others had come to these woods over the years and never left? How many graves lay hidden beneath the pine needles and rich soil? As if reading my thoughts, the voice came again. Not from the back door now, but terrifyingly close to the window near where I stood. "This land remembers everything, you know. Every step, every breath, every drop of blood. It keeps its own accounts." Dylan moved to my side, rifle ready. "He's trying to scare us," he whispered. "Don't listen." But in the encroaching darkness, with unknown figures circling our refuge, it was impossible not to listen. Not to wonder if we would become part of the forest's dark history. Our disappearance just 3 more flyers on a bulletin board in town. The last light faded from the sky, and we were plunged into the absolute darkness that only exists far from civilization. Dylan lit oil lamps, their warm glow creating more shadows than light. We huddled in the center of the living room, backs to each other, watching the windows and doors. The radio remained our lifeline, the Rangers' occasional updates our only connection to the outside world. 30 minutes out. 20 minutes. 10. Then came the sound we've been dreading. Heavy footsteps on the front porch, followed by a powerful impact against the door. The barricade shuddered but held. "They're coming," Dylan said, raising the rifle. "Get behind me." Another impact, the wood of the door splintering at the edges. Mia gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her nails breaking my skin. The third impact sent part of our barricade crashing to the floor. Through the gap in the damaged door, I caught a glimpse of a gaunt face, eyes reflecting the lamplight like an animal's. Dylan fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the confined space of the cabin. There was a momentary retreat, then voices outside, multiple voices conferring in urgent whispers. "How many are there?" I gasped. Dylan shook his head. "I don't know. I thought it was just my uncle, but..." The implication hung in the air between us. Not just one disturbed recluse, but something larger. A darkness that had taken root in these woods and grown over generations. The radio crackled one final time. The Rangers were 5 minutes out. We just needed to hold on. But in the woods, 5 minutes can be an eternity. As we braced for another assault on the door, a new sound froze my blood. Breaking glass from upstairs, followed by heavy footsteps on the ceiling above us. "They're inside," Mia whispered. Dylan pointed the rifle toward the stairs, his face set in grim determination. "Stay behind me." The footsteps moved across the upper floor, slow and deliberate, stopping at the top of the stairs. In the dim light, I could make out a shadow, tall and unnaturally still. "Dylan," came the voice we now recognized as his uncle's. "You should have stayed away. Like your father." He understood in the end. "Don't come down," Dylan warned, his voice breaking. "The Rangers are almost here." A soft laugh from the darkness. "The Rangers have been almost here for quite some time, haven't they? The forest has its own ways of delaying unwanted visitors." I felt a chill of realization. The long delay, the repeated updates that help was just minutes away. Had we been deceived? As if in answer to my unspoken question, headlights suddenly swept across the front windows, vehicles approaching fast along the access road. The shadow at the top of the stairs hesitated. "It seems you've upset the balance," the voice said softly. That was unwise. Before Dylan could respond, there was movement outside, shouts and the beams of powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. The figure on the stairs withdrew, melting back into the shadows of the upper floor. Moments later, the front door burst open and uniformed Rangers poured in, weapons drawn. The cabin was secured, room by room, floor by floor, but by the time they reached the upstairs bedroom with the broken window, it was empty. Whoever had been inside was gone. Over the next hours, the clearing around the cabin transformed into a hub of activity. More vehicles arrived. Police, forensic teams, search dogs. The grave Mia had discovered was carefully excavated, revealing not one body but 3. All hikers reported missing over the past decade. As dawn broke, a detective took our statements. When I described the voice we'd heard, the figure watching the cabin, he exchanged a look with the senior ranger that made my skin crawl. "We've been tracking disappearances in this area for years," he explained. "Always assumed they were accidents. Hikers getting lost, falling in ravines, but after what you've found..." He shook his head. "How long has your uncle lived alone out here?" he asked Dylan. "About 10 years, Dylan replied. "But he's been connected to the property much longer." The detective nodded grimly. "We'll need to search his cabin, and the rest of these woods." As the morning progressed, search teams fanned out into the forest. Dogs tracked a scent from the cabin to a spot where tire tracks indicated a vehicle had been parked. Evidence that whoever had been watching us had fled when the rangers arrived. By noon, I was sitting on the front porch, watching the activity with a numb detachment that I recognized as shock. Dylan sat beside me, his face haggard. "I'm so sorry," he said for perhaps the 10th time. "I never wanted to believe the stories could be true." I didn't respond. What was there to say? That I forgave him for bringing us to a place where his family's dark secrets had nearly gotten us killed? That I understood how he could dismiss decades of warnings as mere superstition? A commotion near the edge of the clearing drew our attention. A search team had returned, and they were calling urgently for the detective. Dylan and I moved closer, catching fragments of their report. Found the cabin, but it was empty. Looks like someone left in a hurry. Disturbed earth all around the property. Could be more graves. The detective ordered an expanded search and approached us with a grim expression. "Your uncle is gone," he told Dylan. "But we found evidence suggesting these 3 bodies aren't the only ones. This investigation is just beginning." As he walked away, Mia joined us. Her face pale but composed. "They're arranging transportation to take us back to town," she said. "We can give more detailed statements there." I nodded, relieved at the thought of leaving this place behind. But as we gathered our belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were carrying something away with us, a knowledge that would haunt us long after we left these woods. In the SUV that transported us back to civilization, I stared out the window at the passing forest. Somewhere among those trees, Dylan's uncle was moving deeper into wilderness, carrying his secrets with him. The authorities would search, but these woods were vast and unforgiving, filled with hidden places where darkness could take root and grow. I thought of the voice that had spoken to us in the cabin, its unsettling familiarity with the land and its history. "This land remembers everything," he had said. "It keeps its own accounts." As the forest finally gave way to open landscape and the first buildings of town appeared, I felt a weight lift from my chest. But even as we pulled into the sheriff's station parking lot, I knew that our ordeal wasn't truly over. The forest might be behind us, but its shadows had followed us out. The town of Whitefish suddenly seemed impossibly bright and normal. Tourists strolling the sidewalks, shops with colorful displays, the mundane rhythm of everyday life continuing as if the darkness in the nearby wilderness didn't exist. How strange that just 20 miles away, search teams were uncovering evidence of horrors that had gone undetected for years. We spent hours at the station, giving detailed statements to a succession of increasingly senior officials. By evening, news vans had gathered outside. The discovery of multiple bodies in Glacier National Park would be national news by morning. The sheriff arranged rooms for us at a local motel, advising us to stay in town until the investigation progressed further. "We have a lot of ground to search," he explained, "and a lot of missing persons cases to potentially connect to this area. Your testimonies may be needed again." That night, in the sterile safety of my motel room, I finally opened my journal and tried to make sense of what had happened. The pages filled quickly. Observations, questions, and fragments of that haunting voice from the darkness. "This land remembers everything." What did that mean? Was it just the ramblings of a disturbed mind, or was there something deeper, something connected to the land itself that had corrupted Dylan's uncle? I was startled by a knock at my door. It was Dylan, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Can we talk?" he asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. "They found more bodies," he said without preamble. 7 so far, in various locations around my uncle's cabin. Some have been there for decades. I felt cold despite the warm night. Decades? Then this started long before your uncle moved out there permanently. Dylan nodded, looking up at me with haunted eyes. They found an old journal in his cabin. It belonged to my grandfather. Dylan's voice broke. He was part of it. Maybe even started it. The photograph flashed in my mind. Those grim-faced men with their rifles, the tension between Dylan's father and grandfather. Had his father discovered the truth that summer in '87? Had he fled, never to return, while his brother stayed and eventually continued their father's dark legacy? The detective thinks it's some kind of family tradition. Dylan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. A sickness passed down, protected. Is that why your family kept the cabin? To keep people away from what was hidden in those woods? I don't know, Dylan admitted. My dad never talked about it, never explained why he wouldn't go back. I always thought it was just the feud with his brother. He looked up, his eyes wet. What if he was trying to protect me by keeping me away? What if he knew what was out there, but couldn't bring himself to tell anyone? I didn't have answers for him. The magnitude of what we'd discovered, what had nearly happened to us, was still sinking in. They haven't found your uncle, I said finally. Dylan shook his head. They think he fled deeper into the wilderness. There are parts of those mountains where you could disappear for years if you knew the terrain well enough. And he does, I murmured, remembering the way he had moved through the darkness, always watching, always unseen until he chose to reveal himself. Dylan stayed a while longer, both of us finding some comfort in not being alone with our thoughts. Before he left, he paused at the door. Alex, that night in the cabin when he spoke to us, did you feel like there was something more? Something beyond just one disturbed man? I knew exactly what he meant. That voice from the darkness had carried an authority, a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond one person's madness. I don't know, I answered honestly. But whatever it was, it's been taking hold in those woods for generations, and it's still out there. 2 days later, searchers found a hiking boot matching the one from the first grave, but in a different location. A message, the detective believed, from Dylan's uncle. I'm still here, still watching. By the end of the week, we were allowed to leave town, though with promises to remain available for the ongoing investigation. The story had broken nationally by then. Glacier Park killer, decades of disappearances linked to Mountain Man. Though the full extent of the family connection was being kept from the media for now. Mia and I flew back together, Dylan having chosen to stay longer to help authorities understand the family property better. At the airport, before we boarded separate connecting flights, Mia hugged me tightly. Will you be okay? She asked. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Eventually, you? She managed a small smile. I'm going to spend some time in the city, very bright, very crowded places for a while. I understood perfectly. The darkness and isolation of those woods now seemed like a nightmare from which I was still trying to wake. Back in Chicago, I tried to resume my normal life. I accepted the marketing internship I'd nearly turned down, threw myself into senior year preparations, and did my best to forget what had happened in Montana. But at night, sleep remained elusive. I would jolt awake from dreams of watching eyes in the forest, of that soft voice speaking from darkness. 3 weeks after our return, I received a package from Dylan, a small box containing a USB drive and a handwritten note. Alex, they found my grandfather's complete journals. The prosecutor let me make a copy before they became evidence. I thought you should know the truth, all of it. The story goes back further than we imagined. I'm not coming back to school. I need time to process what my family has done, what we've been part of without knowing. I'm sorry for bringing you into this. More than I can ever say. Dylan. That night, I plugged in the drive and began reading the digitized pages of a journal that had begun in 1947, when Dylan's grandfather had first acquired the land. What unfolded over decades of entries was more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. The first entries were mundane. A young man proud of his mountain property, building a cabin with his brothers, hunting and fishing in pristine wilderness. But gradually, the tone changed. References to the voices in the trees appeared. Then, the agreement and the sacrifice. By the 1960s, the entries had become explicit. Descriptions of hikers lured from trails, given to the forest in exchange for some perceived protection or blessing. Most chilling was the matter-of-fact way these horrors were described, not as the actions of a madman, but as a caretaker fulfilling a duty, a bargain maintained, a balance preserved. The final entries, from the late 1980s, described the growing conflict with his son, Dylan's father, who had discovered what was happening and threatened to go to the authorities. The journal ended abruptly after that fateful summer of '87. What had begun as one man's delusion had been inherited by his son, Dylan's uncle, and continued for decades more, claiming victim after victim in the vast wilderness, where disappearances could so easily be attributed to accidents or exposure. I forwarded the files to the detective in Montana, then deleted them from my computer, wanting no trace of those thoughts in my home. But I couldn't delete them from my mind. Months passed. The investigation continued, with periodic updates making national news. More bodies were found. Cold cases from across 3 decades were reopened and connected to the area. Dylan's uncle remained at large, though sightings were occasionally reported in remote areas of the park. I graduated and took a job with a marketing firm in New York, about as far from the wilderness as I could get. I found an apartment on the 27th floor of a high-rise, surrounded by concrete and glass and the constant noise of the city. No forests, no silence, no darkness that wasn't broken by artificial light. I rarely spoke about what had happened in Montana, though I followed the news obsessively. A year after our discovery, they finally captured Dylan's uncle. Not in the wilderness as expected, but in a small town in Idaho, where he had been living quietly for months. The trial that followed revealed the full extent of what had happened in those woods. Not just the killings, but the elaborate mythology that had developed around them, passed from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. Dylan testified, though I did not. His testimony about his family's legacy was more devastating than any physical evidence. After the trial ended with multiple life sentences, we met briefly outside the courthouse. "Are you okay?" I asked, though it seemed an absurd question given everything that had happened. He shrugged, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay, but I'm trying to understand." Understand what? How this happened. How a place, a piece of land, could become so entwined with darkness. Whether it was always there in the forest, or if my grandfather brought it with him. He looked at me directly for the first time. "Do you ever think about what he said that night? About the land remembering?" I nodded, unable to forget those words that had haunted my dreams for months after our escape. "I've been researching," Dylan continued. "The land where our cabin stood. Before my grandfather bought it, it belonged to native tribes who avoided that specific area. There were stories about it being a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, where things could cross over." I felt a chill despite the warm day. "Do you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," he admitted. "But I know that whatever happened in those woods wasn't just about my uncle, or even my grandfather. It was something older, something that found willing vessels in them." We parted soon after, promising to stay in touch but both knowing we probably wouldn't. Some experiences create a connection that's too painful to maintain. Years have passed since then. I've built a life in the city, surrounded by people and noise and light. I rarely think about Montana or the cabin or the graves hidden beneath pine needles. But sometimes, when I find myself alone in quiet places, I remember that voice from the darkness. This land remembers everything. It keeps its own accounts. And I wonder about those accounts, about the ledger of blood and bone that accumulated in those mountains over decades, about the darkness that found a home there, whether brought by men or awakened from the land itself. I wonder, too, about other remote places where the wilderness stretches unbroken for miles, about other cabins with their own dark histories, other families with their own terrible secrets, about the thin boundaries between worlds and what might cross over when no one is watching. But mostly I stay in the city, where the forest cannot reach me, where the only shadows are those cast by buildings, and the only voices are human ones. And at night, when I look out my window at the endless grid of lights that is New York, I feel safe in the knowledge that here, at least, I am surrounded by civilization in all directions. Yet sometimes, when the wind blows hard against my windows, I imagine I hear whispers in it, reminders that the wilderness is never truly far away, and that some part of me remains forever in those dark woods, listening to a voice that knew too much about the land and its hungry memories. Some nights I still write in my journal. Not the events themselves, which I've documented as completely as I can, but the questions that remain. Was it madness passed through generations of Dylan's family, or was there something in that specific place that corrupted those who stayed too long? I have no answers, only the lingering certainty that whatever happened in those mountains is not yet over. The last news report I saw mentioned that the property had been seized by the state and would eventually be incorporated into the national park. The cabins were to be demolished, the land restored to wilderness. I wonder if that will be enough to break whatever cycle began there decades ago. If removing all traces of human habitation will allow the forest to forget what was done in its shadows. But I suspect the land remembers longer than we can imagine. That beneath the new growth and fallen leaves, it holds every drop of blood, every shallow grave, every whispered bargain made in darkness. And sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I imagine Dylan's uncle in his prison cell, smiling at the knowledge that although he was caught, something older and darker remains free, waiting in the deep woods for new caretakers, new bargains, new sacrifices, waiting with the patience of ancient trees for someone else to wander down that forgotten trail and hear the whispers that begin so innocently. Come deeper. I have something to show you. I keep my doors locked, even here in my high-rise apartment. I avoid forests and remote cabins. I've declined every invitation to hike or camp since that summer. But still, I wonder if distance is enough. If whatever awakened in those mountains might someday find me again, drawn by the knowledge I carry. And so I remain in the bright, crowded city, telling myself that here I am safe. That here, at least, the wilderness cannot reach me. That the voice from the darkness is just a memory, fading with time. But part of me knows better. Part of me understands now what Dylan's father must have felt when he fled those mountains and never returned. The knowledge that some things once seen cannot be unseen. That some voices once heard continue to echo long after we've tried to forget them. This land remembers everything, and so it seems, do I. Every day blurred into the next, an endless cycle of early mornings fueled by bitter coffee and late nights illuminated by the glow of a computer screen. As a graphic designer at a demanding agency in downtown Chicago, Late shifts had become as familiar as my morning commute. My workspace, littered with half-empty cups, scattered sketches, and digital files meticulously arranged yet endlessly multiplying, felt less like a job and more like a relentless tide of tasks. On that particular evening, the clock had crawled past midnight before I finally finished the presentation due the next morning. The strain of the day etched deeply into my weary posture. Fatigue clung heavily to my bones as I packed away my belongings, meticulously sliding each item into my worn leather satchel. My hands trembled slightly from exhaustion as I shut down my workstation, the gentle hum of the cooling computer fading into silence. With a lingering glance around the empty office, now eerily quiet without the usual hum of activity, I turned off the lights, plunging the space into darkness. Stepping outside, I was greeted by the chill of the late-night air, sharp and invigorating against my tired skin. The street stretched empty before me, bathed in a hazy amber glow from street lamps whose pools of light seemed oddly distant and disconnected. The faint echo of distant traffic barely reached my ears, creating an atmosphere of surreal isolation. As I walked toward the subway station several blocks away, I quickened my pace instinctively, the sharp click of my heels reverberating softly off the buildings, echoing gently through the quiet. A sense of vulnerability washed over me, heightened by the solitude of the city streets at this late hour. I glanced around occasionally, checking shadows and empty doorways, my heart beating slightly faster each time. Descending the worn steps into the subway felt like entering another world altogether. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, starkly illuminating graffiti-covered tiles that told silent stories of urban decay and restless creativity. The air was stale and thick, tinged with the metallic scent of distant trains and the lingering traces of human presence. My footsteps echoed against the tiled walls as I moved onto the deserted platform, my eyes quickly assessing my surroundings. At the far end of the platform, barely illuminated by the flickering overhead lights, sat a distant figure hunched quietly over themselves, face obscured. Instinctively cautious, I positioned myself near the center of the platform, maintaining a careful distance, my fingers nervously gripping the strap of my satchel. My gaze repeatedly drifted down the dark tunnel, anxiously awaiting the train's arrival, silently urging it to rescue me from the oppressive emptiness of the station. The approaching rumble of the train offered brief comfort as its headlights pierced the gloom. I boarded quickly, choosing a seat near the exit doors, grateful to find the carriage mostly empty. A middle-aged woman sat a few seats away, nodding off intermittently. Opposite me, a young man with headphones stared absently into his phone. As the train jolted forward, the rhythmic sway began to lull me into a sense of security. The stops ticked by uneventfully, passengers steadily disembarking until only the sleepy woman and I remained. She exited at the next station, leaving me alone in a cavernous silence, broken only by the mechanical groans of the carriage. An odd sense of vulnerability began to seep into me. The emptiness seemed magnified, every sound amplified. My eyes darted around nervously, heart rate rising inexplicably. It felt ridiculous, yet an instinctual unease refused to dissipate. The train pulled into the next station, its brakes squealing loudly as it gradually slowed to a stop. The doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit, nearly deserted platform, with walls lined in faded, peeling advertisements. A solitary man stood beneath a flickering light, casting an elongated shadow that stretched ominously across the platform floor. He stepped into my carriage with deliberate slowness, his movements measured, almost mechanical. Immediately, a wave of unsettling tension emanated from him, tangible enough to tighten my chest. His attire was deliberately unremarkable, A dark jacket zipped up to the neck, worn denim jeans fraying slightly at the cuffs, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, effectively shielding his eyes. Yet his posture betrayed something unsettlingly abnormal. His back ramrod straight, shoulders rigidly squared as if every muscle were locked in place. The doors hissed closed behind him, cutting off any possibility of escape as the train lurched back into motion. My heart rate quickened involuntarily, a thin sheen of cold sweat forming at the base of my neck. Although I couldn't see his eyes beneath the brim of his cap, I felt his stare like a physical force pressing against me. His hands rested motionlessly in his lap, fingers interlaced in an unnaturally controlled manner, betraying no nervousness or casual indifference, only calm, focused intensity. My pulse quickened with anxiety, each heartbeat echoing loudly in my ears. Attempting to appear indifferent, I feigned deep concentration on my phone, scrolling aimlessly while stealing discreet glances at the figure opposite me. Each cautious glance heightened my alarm, confirming my growing paranoia. He remained utterly motionless, yet his intense focus never wavered, as though he could sense every subtle movement I made. I desperately tried to rationalize my fears, attributing them to exhaustion, paranoia, the late hour, any reason to dismiss the oppressive dread gripping me. But every passing second seemed to stretch endlessly, each one amplifying my discomfort. When I risked another quick glance, my stomach clenched painfully. The man had subtly shifted closer, now seated only a few seats away, his presence inescapably oppressive. The narrowing gap between us sent a fresh wave of panic surging through my veins, chilling me to the bone. As my stop finally approached, dread mingled with relief. Rising quickly, I approached the door, gripping the pole tightly as the train slowed. The man stood simultaneously, mimicking my movement. My heart began to hammer uncontrollably. The doors opened, and I rushed onto the platform, casting a frantic glance backward. He followed closely, matching my pace exactly. Fear clouded my thoughts as I hurried toward the staircase leading to street level. Behind me, the echo of footsteps matched my rhythm, deliberate and unhurried. Adrenaline surged as I ascended the steps two at a time, bursting onto the empty street above. Desperation guided my movements toward a nearby 24-hour convenience store, its brightly lit windows a beacon of safety. But a sudden sound behind me, a harsh intake of breath, froze me momentarily. Turning sharply, I saw him standing just feet away, still silent, still watching. Summoning every ounce of courage, I bolted towards the store. Pushing through the door, I nearly collided with the startled cashier. Breathlessly, I explained the situation. The employee quickly locked the doors, peering cautiously outside. Through the glass, I saw the man linger briefly before slowly retreating into the shadows. The cashier called a cab, reassuring me gently until its arrival. Trembling, I recounted the night's events in fragmented whispers, profoundly shaken by my close encounter. As the cab whisked me safely home, the city lights blurred through my tears. Though physically unharmed, I was emotionally scarred. In the nights that followed, sleep evaded me, haunted by echoes of footsteps and the silent menace of a stranger. The familiar route home was forever tainted. A chilling reminder of how swiftly ordinary life could shift into a nightmare, leaving lasting shadows long after safety was regained.